to serve as Minister of Energy and Electrification, and I know all members of Cabinet are too, as we deliver on the agenda the people of Ontario sent us to deliver, which is affordability, a reliable supply of energy, the construction of infrastructure, of hospitals and roads and highways, and that's the commitment that we are making today, renewing that commitment to the people of Ontario.
Well, as you saw right here last night on Power Play, Ontario Premier Doug Ford shook up his cabinet with a major shuffle. Some of those moves included moving Stephen Lecce from education to the energy file. Former Housing Minister Steve Clark is back in cabinet as government House Leader. Actually not in cabinet, just government House Leader. But you may remember that Clark resigned his cabinet portfolio last year amidst the Greenbelt scandal. So here's the thing, though. It'll be a while before you get a look at Ford's new front bench at Queen's Park. That's because he also adjourned the legislature until October 21st.
This is a government that doesn't actually want to get any work done and doesn't want to be held to account because guess what? This is a corrupt government. This is a corrupt premier. You know what? He wants to sue me? Go for it. Come on out.
Almost 5-month-long prorogation that work will not be done here in the legislature. I find that very undemocratic and disrespectful to the voter.
All right, so clearly opposition parties aren't happy, but is their anger justified? And what does this shuffle say about the direction the Ford government is about to take? Let's bring in our front bench. Melanie Paradis is the former communications director to Aaron O'Toole. She is now the president of Texture Communications. Former Ontario NDP MPP Guritan Singh. He is now the vice president at Crestview Strategy. He's also the brother of federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. And with me here in studio, Sabrina Grover. She's a former federal Liberal candidate in the 2021 election. She's a senior advisor at Spark Advocacy and North Star Public Affairs, and CTV News senior digital parliamentary reporter Rachel Aiello. Welcome all. Melanie, I'm going to start with you. What do you think about the outrage from the opposition members?
I think it's rather silly. Look, the government obviously continues to function regardless of whether the legislature is sitting or not. And this has been a government that has gotten a ton done in the past couple of years, and they still have a robust agenda ahead of them. This shuffle had some pretty interesting moves. We've seen a swap out of Stephen Lecce and Todd Smith for one another. Both incredibly effective communicators with excellent records behind them. Stephen Lecce has been the Minister of Education for, I think, 5 years now. And has gotten a ton done in that portfolio. We're talking about like a cell phone ban that I'm personally very excited about, because by the time my son goes to school, there won't be cell phones in schools anymore, and I'm looking forward to that. I know it's been a plague for many students and certainly for teachers. It's also gotten through 2 negotiation rounds with all the teachers. That's a big deal to get through. And so now I think they're handing this over to Todd Smith, who is Doug Ford's best penalty killer, to use a sports analogy. And the job will be keep this out of the newspapers, make education boring again, and ensure that that's not a hot topic, so that Stephen Lecce can instead focus on energy and wedging Bonnie Crombie on the carbon tax in particular.
Guritan, you heard Marit Stiles. She was making a big deal over Steve Clark coming back into the fold after resigning his post over the Greenbelt scandal. Do you have an issue with him being back at the table?
I think in general, what we see from the Ford government right now is that they realize that they have a lot of baggage. So they have Steve Clark, who had resigned over the Greenbelt scandal, which has now resulted in an ongoing RCMP investigation with the Ford government. We see across the board people in Ontario still struggling with things like affordability, with healthcare, with $1,500 cut per student in our schools. So I think what you see is this trying to be a bit of a rebrand or a refresh for what is likely to be an early election sometime next spring. And this is the team that'll be being presented for that election. But I think in general, my issue is that this government does have a lot of negative baggage around them. And I don't think this refresh of some new leadership in cabinet, and an incredibly large cabinet. It's funny to mention, I think Mike Harris was the previous Conservative, then leader, then later Premier, of course, who campaigned against large cabinets in Ontario. And now we have one of the largest. So all of this collectively just seems like the government's trying to change the channel on a lot of bad news stories that keep on following them.
Yeah, and Sabrina, welcome in studio, by the way. Great to have you here. What do you think this shuffle says about the direction that Doug Ford wants to take this government, but specifically with Stephen Lecce? Because as Melanie sort of just mentioned, I mean, he handled a pretty tough file, and if we wanted to keep that sports analogy going, I mean, I don't know if you'd call him the top scorer because of what he was able to do. Giving him the energy file, does that give you an indication of where the government wants to go?
Well, I mean, let's just start by saying, like, move over Kendrick and Drake, because the biggest beef in for the summer is going to be the PC Party of Ontario and the federal Conservatives, and Jamil Javani, because I think if you're paying attention to X, like, that's obviously come up several times, specifically on the education file. And so I think it's interesting to see how those interactions are actually going to shape how this cabinet shuffle plays out and what happens next with education and with Lecce and Todd Smith. I think obviously he did handle that file, but I think that, Doug Ford is ready to go for an election. We can see that in a lot of his actions, both with respect to this cabinet shuffle and with respect to the LCB and O announcement last week. And I think he's just kind of getting himself cabinet ready, making sure that there's no mishandling of any files. I think that there's definitely some tension between Lecce and the group of stakeholders he's responsible for, teachers. And I think that that's why you've seen him move over to the energy file. Still a tough file, still a lot of responsibility. But at the end of the day, I think the question is going to become for Doug Ford, like, even if you have this stellar front bench ready for cabinet, can you win an election? You have 2.5 million Ontarians that don't have a family doctor. You have an RCMP investigation that's following you. Can he really get ahead of this just with a cabinet shuffle? I think that remains to be seen.
Rachel, what do you think about that pre-positioning for an election? Because there's a lot of that question as to whether or not Doug Ford wants to go before the federal government.
Yeah, in watching this unfold yesterday, that was what was front and center for me. It was that reporting we've seen that he wants to get out ahead of Poilievre and call an early Ontario election. And what you heard in the rhetoric from the opposition parties kind of was like textbook that for me. This cabinet is bloated. He's taking this long break off over the summer to go politic with your money and make all these announcements. And so those things to me, I do think signal further bolstering that reporting that we could be into an early election. And then just interesting, I think the other factor on the energy file is largely that is something that the federal government has kind of helped them along with lately. We've seen these EV announcements and things like that. So I'm curious to see the dynamic with Stephen Lecce moving into that position. Him and Melissa Lantsman, the deputy Conservative federally, are close. So I'm wondering if there's going to be some talking there, tactics picking up, and if we're going to see a different kind of dynamic between the two layers of government on that file.
Yeah, speak a bit to that, Melanie, because we've seen the Ford government almost tripping over themselves, really, at some of these announcements with the Trudeau government. And are we going to start to see some sort of a bromance between Stephen Lecce and François-Philippe Champagne?
Well, look, this government is all about getting things done and working with whatever partners they need to work with in order to do that for the people of Ontario. And so I think that...
So that's a yes, is what you're saying. It's a bromance. You're calling it, aren't you? Come on.
Hot political summer.
Stephen Lecce is really great at building relationships with any willing partner. And so I think that he's going to do a great job in this file. Electrification is a really important issue in Ontario. We've got industries from all over the world who are coming to Ontario because we have a clean green grid, and they're continuing to ramp up our nuclear power so that we have even more energy. We've got data centers that want to come here. We've got the automotive sector that's coming and building here. They have been more attracted to Ontario than ever before because of this government. And so if they're going to work with the federal government, why not? That just means more jobs for Ontarians.
Gertin, it's interesting because when I asked Marit Stiles whether or not she was ready to go to the polls and try and tell that story, she says that she is, but have they been doing a good enough job when you consider where the polls are right now and Doug Ford still has a healthy lead? Do you think that the NDP specifically needs to up their game on that front?
I think we've seen some pretty strong leadership from Marit Stiles specifically. When we look at the Green Belt reversal, something that was a big setback for the Ford government when this issue being pressed forward, it was largely Marit Stiles who led the charge. And we continue to see that kind of strong leadership on a variety of issues, be it our healthcare system, be it the state of our schools and more. So I think Marit has done a really fantastic job as a leader, but clearly more work needs to be done as a whole, pushing the current government based on polling numbers. But I do think that as we get closer to an election and people realize that affordability issues are still top of mind, when people still see they're struggling to put food on the table and they look to a government that will have at that point probably around 7 years, I think that alternative voice of March Stiles and NDP will become louder and louder, and they'll see her track record. And I'm hopeful that there'll be far more traction with her and the amazing work that she's doing.
And Sabrina, just with you here, what about what Bonnie Crombie has to do? And if it is a shorter period between now and the next election, does she really have to start ramping it up?
Well, I think it's interesting because, kind of what to Melanie said, like the federal or the Doug Ford government is really riding the coattails of federal investments and really hitching their wagon to Justin Trudeau in a lot of ways because they've benefited from a lot of that. Of course, he's going to run kind of an anti-carbon tax election as well, and he wants that to be the question. But the other question is, like, what is Bonnie Crombie hitching her wagon to? It's easy enough to say that, Doug Ford's corrupt and that we've had all these investigations and that, he's got an $8 billion boondoggle. But what vision are you presenting to voters? And I think that that's where Bonnie really has to dig in right now, right? Is like providing those ideas to move forward for Ontario, providing something for Ontarians to vote for, as opposed to just voting against Doug Ford.
Yeah, and if recent polls are to be believed, she's probably not hitching her wagon to the federal Liberals.
No, Mark Carney, according to some
and Mark Carney
events.
is going to be appearing with her. Okay, we're going to give our front bench just a quick little break. When we come back,